Jason Wolfe leaned back in the leather chair of his penthouse suite, a crystal tumbler of scotch resting on his knee, the vast Pacific stretching out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sunlight scattered diamonds across the water, the horizon melting into soft streaks of gold and violet. The Pacific Mirage Hotel was everything it promised, exclusive, discreet, and perched on the Malibu cliffs like a glass jewel. For most people, this view would be the stuff of dreams. For Jason, it was Tuesday. He exhaled, the slow burn of the whiskey warming his throat. His phone buzzed on the table, lighting up with yet another urgent message. Board call. 5 p.m. Urgent. Jason turned the screen face down without reading the rest. He was supposed to be off. That's what his assistant, Derek, had insisted. What the doctors had quietly suggested after the tension headache turned into something resembling a minor cardiac scare. 3 days. 3 days to step away from Wolfe Innovations, the empire he had built brick by digital brick. But even now, Jason's mind ticked over numbers, strategies, headlines, a hostile takeover rumor. A tech rival sniffing around his board. They could wait. He swirled the scotch in his glass and leaned his head against the chair, closing his eyes for a moment. From the outside, Jason Wolfe had everything. Billions in the bank, a global company, a sleek mansion in Bel Air, a Gulf Stream that waited at his beck and call. His face appeared on magazine covers. Forbes had recently called him the reluctant king of Silicon Valley. Women chased him. Investors feared him. And yet here he sat, on vacation, alone. The knock on the door startled him. Room service. Jason rose, smoothing his linen shirt, and opened the door to a silver-haired waiter, who wheeled in a cart. Dinner, perfectly plated, though Jason had little appetite. The man smiled politely, left a card, and quietly withdrew. Jason tipped generously, as always, but the door clicking shut echoed too loudly in the cavernous suite. He sat at the table, the smell of grilled fish and herbs wafting up, and stared at the empty chair across from him. Once, years ago, Sophie would have been there, laughing over a glass of Pinot, barefoot with her legs tucked under her, teasing him for checking his phone. But that was 4 years and 1,000 miles of silence ago. Jason pushed the plate aside and walked to the balcony. Below, the pool sparkled with lights. Couples laughed over cocktails on the patio. A family with 2 small kids darted through the gardens, their giggles ringing up through the night air. Jason watched, a faint twist pulling at his mouth. He told himself often and convincingly that he didn't need any of that relationships were distractions, that love was a liability. He had learned that lesson the hard way when Sophie walked out, tired of being married to a man whose first love was his company. His phone buzzed again. Derek. Jason didn't answer. Instead, he leaned against the balcony rail and closed his eyes, listening to the waves crush against the rocks below. Somewhere, deep in his chest, was a quiet ache he never quite shook. The sharp, familiar edge of loneliness wrapped in power's glittering robe. A sudden burst of laughter caught his attention. Jason opened his eyes, gaze drawn to the hotel's grand entrance far below. A woman had just stepped out of a black SUV, dark hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders. She bent down, lifting a small child from the car, adjusting the child's backpack as they crossed the drive. Jason's breath hitched. For a heartbeat, his mind rejected what his eyes saw. He was imagining things. Malibu was full of beautiful women with dark hair. He was overtired. But then she turned slightly, guiding the child's hand into hers. And in the curve of her cheek, the graceful tilt of her head, the familiar tension in her shoulders as she looked both protective and determined, Jason knew Sophie, his ex-wife. And the little girl clinging to her hand, head tipped back as she gazed at the glowing lobby chandeliers, looked to be 3, maybe 4. She had dark curls like Sophie's, but when she turned, something electric went through Jason's chest. Blue eyes. His eyes. Jason's fingers tightened on the balcony rail. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. He watched, frozen, as Sophie and the child disappeared through the hotel's revolving doors, swallowed by the lobby's golden light. Jason swallowed hard, his heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with boardroom stress or market crashes. For a man who had built his life on knowing everything, predicting every move, outplaying every opponent, he had never seen this coming. Jason Wolfe stood frozen on the balcony, the ocean breeze tousling his hair, but he barely felt it. Sophie. And that child. His heart slammed against his ribs, a drumbeat of confusion, disbelief, and something more primal, panic. He tried to tell himself it was a coincidence, that Sophie was just another guest checking in, that the child wasn't. But those eyes, those unmistakable blue eyes. Jason stepped back into the suite, pacing across the polished marble floors. His mind raced, flicking through memories he hadn't touched in years. The night Sophie left, her voice raw with exhaustion, the way she had cradled her stomach as if protecting herself, though at the time he thought it was just a defensive posture. The calls she never returned, the silence that had stretched, thick and permanent, between them. Could it be? He checked the time, nearly 8 p.m., and hesitated only a moment before grabbing his blazer from the back of a chair. His fingers fumbled at the sleeves, uncharacteristically clumsy, and his pulse hammered as he caught his reflection in the mirror. He looked tired. More tired than a man with everything should look. Downstairs, the lobby hummed with quiet luxury, soft jazz, the clink of crystal glasses, guests in designer resort wear murmuring over cocktails. Jason scanned the room, his eyes sharp, almost predatory, until they landed on her. Sophie was at the reception desk, head bent slightly as she spoke with the clerk, her dark hair slipping forward to shield her face. She wore a simple linen dress, casual sandals, no jewelry except a thin gold band around her wrist. So different from the polished, media-ready women who usually orbited his world. And at her side, the little girl stood, one thumb tucked into her mouth, the other hand clutching the strap of a small pink backpack. Jason's chest tightened. He forced himself to move, one deliberate step after another, the sound of his own footsteps unusually loud in his ears. Sophie turned, just as he reached them. For a beat, neither of them spoke. Her eyes widened, her shoulders stiffened, and Jason saw her instinctively tighten her hold on the child. "Jason," Sophie said softly, almost like an exhale. "Sophie." His voice was lower than he intended, threaded with something between shock and accusation. His gaze flicked to the child. "You—" "Not here." Sophie's eyes flashed with quiet warning, the kind that once could silence him mid-argument. She glanced at the guests drifting nearby, at the concierge eyeing them with polite curiosity. Jason swallowed hard. "Where?" "I'll meet you outside." 15 minutes. Her voice was steady, but Jason saw it, the faint tremble in her fingers as she smoothed the child's hair. His jaw tightened. He wanted to demand answers now, to pull her into some corner and unravel the years between them. But the look in Sophie's eyes stopped him. She hadn't come here for a scene. Jason nodded once, sharp and controlled, and turned on his heel. Out on the terrace, the air was cooler, the ocean a dark, restless expanse. Jason gripped the edge of a stone pillar, trying to slow the rush of thoughts in his head. 15 minutes. 15 minutes to prepare for a conversation that could shatter the foundation of his life. He thought of the boardroom, the conference calls, the endless negotiations where he always had the upper hand. He had never walked into a meeting unprepared, until now. "Daddy." Jason's heart nearly stopped. He turned, his chest tightening, but it was a boy darting past, calling for his father across the terrace. Jason let out a shaky breath and dragged a hand through his hair. He felt foolish, off balance, exposed. Footsteps approached softly. Jason turned again, and there she was. Sophie. No longer the fierce young journalist he remembered. No longer the woman he once accused of giving up too easily. But someone quieter now. Stronger in a way that wasn't loud. And beside her, the child. "Maya!" The name hit him unexpectedly as Sophie murmured it, encouraging the girl forward. Jason watched as Maya hesitated, peeking out from behind Sophie's leg. Jason crouched slightly, instinctively lowering himself to her height. "Hi." His voice was rough, unpolished. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Hi there." Maya blinked up at him, eyes wide and watchful. Sophie rested a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Sweetheart, this is Jason." "He's an old friend." Jason flinched at the word, but he understood why Sophie said it, why this moment couldn't be rushed. Maya clutched a stuffed rabbit to her chest and buried her face in Sophie's side. Jason's throat tightened. Sophie met his eyes. "We should talk." Jason nodded, forcing air into his lungs. He wanted to demand, to argue, to rage against the years he had lost. But all he could do was say quietly, "Yes, we should." Sophie glanced down at Maya. "Can you play over there for a little bit, baby? Just by the benches?" Maya looked between them, suspicious, but at her mother's coaxing, she drifted toward a cluster of seats, dragging the rabbit behind her. Jason waited until she was out of earshot before speaking. His voice came out raw. "Is she—" "Yes," Sophie whispered, her eyes glistening. "She's yours." Jason staggered back a half step, a hollow ache opening in his chest. He had prepared himself for many things in life: hostile takeovers, failed IPOs, political scandals, but not this. Not the news that somewhere along the way, while he had been conquering the world, he had missed the most important part of his own. Jason stood perfectly still, but inside the ground felt like it had shifted under his feet. "She's yours." The words rattled around in his head, sharp and surreal, as if Sophie had just tossed a grenade into his carefully ordered life. For a man used to controlling every outcome, Jason Wolfe had never been so utterly unprepared. He studied Sophie's face in the dim light of the terrace, noticing for the first time the small changes, fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the softness that had settled into her features. She looked tired, but not fragile. There was a quiet strength there now, something he hadn't seen when they were together. And then his gaze flicked to the little girl sitting on the bench a few feet away, swinging her legs and whispering softly to her stuffed rabbit. His chest tightened. Maya, his daughter. How? Jason's voice was rough, unsteady. How is this the first time I'm hearing about her? Sophie folded her arms across her chest, glancing away as if gathering herself. Because when I left, you were already halfway gone. Jason flinched. I tried to tell you, she continued, voice low. I came to your office. You were always in a meeting. Always at the next deal. And after a while, Her shoulders lifted in a small, defeated shrug. I stopped trying. Jason let out a slow breath, dragging a hand through his hair. You should have told me anyway. Sophie's eyes flashed. And you should have noticed I was drowning. The words hit him harder than he expected. He looked away, toward the ocean where the waves crashed against the rocks. For years, he'd told himself their marriage ended because they'd grown apart, because Sophie hadn't understood his drive. But now, standing here, Jason realized he had never asked if she needed him to understand her. She's beautiful, he murmured, watching Maya lean over to examine a shell near the bench. She has your mouth. And your eyes, Sophie said softly, a wistful smile ghosting across her lips. I never could have hidden that, even if I wanted to. Jason swallowed hard. Does she know about me? Sophie shook her head. Not the way you're thinking. She knows she has a father somewhere. She knows you're important. But she doesn't know you're Jason Wolf, billionaire tech tycoon. Her mouth curved into something bitter. I wanted her to have a childhood first. Jason flinched at the edge in her voice. And what now? Why here? Why now? Sophie looked at him then, her dark eyes clear. Because she's been asking questions. Because I was tired of dodging them. And maybe because, she added quietly, part of me wondered if you were still the man I married, or if you'd turned into the man I feared you'd become. Jason stiffened. And what's your verdict? Sophie gave a small, sad laugh. Jury's still out. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the air thick between them. Jason looked at Maya again, at the way her curls fell into her eyes, at the way she hummed softly to herself, lost in a world of her own making. He felt something sharp twist in his chest. 3 years. 3 years of first steps, first words, first birthdays. Gone. I want to know her, he said quietly. I want to be in her life. Sophie's arms tightened around her waist. I'm not saying no, Jason, but I'm not saying yes either. His brow furrowed. Why? Because you're Jason Wolf, Sophie said softly. Because you have a world at your feet, and people orbiting around you, and a company worth billions. And because my little girl has no idea what it means to have a father like that. Jason opened his mouth, but Sophie held up a hand. And because I'm terrified you'll do what you've always done, swoop in, take control, and then disappear when something more important comes along. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Jason exhaled, a faint tremor running through his fingers. I can't change the past, Sophie. I know. Her voice softened. But if you want a place in her life, you'll have to show me and her that you can be different. Jason nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt small, not in power or wealth, but in the only way that mattered. Sophie drew in a shaky breath. One step at a time, Jason. He glanced at Maya again. Where do I start? Sophie hesitated, then gave him the smallest, most unexpected gift. A smile. With patience. Jason watched as she crossed the terrace toward Maya, crouching beside her to whisper something in her ear. Maya peeked over Sophie's shoulder at him, shy and curious, and Jason felt his chest tighten all over again. He had faced boardrooms, governments, and the relentless press. He had crushed rivals and built empires. But this quiet, trembling hope, this was the hardest negotiation of his life. And for once, Jason Wolf knew the stakes were exactly where they should be. Jason hadn't slept. The entire night, He sat on the suite's balcony, scotch untouched on the table beside him, the waves below beating out a steady rhythm that only made the silence louder. He kept replaying the conversation with Sophie, turning it over and over in his mind like a stone he couldn't set down. She's yours. She doesn't know you. One step at a time. By sunrise, Jason Wolf, self-made billionaire, tech mogul, man who prided himself on controlling outcomes, felt more uncertain than he had in his entire life. At breakfast, Jason spotted them at a corner table on the terrace. Sophie in a soft blue dress, hair pulled into a loose braid, sipping coffee. And beside her, Maya, legs swinging under the chair, focused intently on a plate of pancakes. He stood in the doorway, smoothing a hand over the back of his neck, momentarily frozen. Derek would have teased him for this. His razor-sharp assistant, with his dry one-liners and impeccable instinct, had a knack for knocking Jason off his high horse when necessary. Where was Derek when you needed him? Taking a breath, Jason walked over, his shoes quiet against the slate floor. Sophie looked up first. Their eyes met, and for a moment Jason forgot the script he'd been rehearsing all morning. Her gaze softened just slightly, an almost smile that flickered and disappeared. "Good morning," Jason offered, keeping his voice low, careful. Maya peeked up from her pancakes, a streak of syrup at the corner of her mouth. She tilted her head, considering him with the wide-eyed seriousness of a child sizing up a stranger. "Hi, Maya," Jason said gently. Maya didn't respond. Instead, she reached for her stuffed rabbit, clutching it close and shifted a little toward Sophie. Jason felt the sting in his chest but forced a quiet smile. Sophie gestured to the empty chair. "Do you want to sit?" He pulled out the chair, hands unsteady in a way that would have embarrassed him anywhere else. "Thank you." For a while, the only sounds were the clink of silverware and Maya's soft humming as she colored on the edge of her placemat. Jason tried to ignore the curious glances from other guests, the unmistakable ripple that went through any room when a man like him appeared. "Big day today?" Sophie asked, arching an eyebrow. Jason blinked, then realized she was teasing. He huffed out a soft laugh, trying to take it slow. "You?" Sophie's lips curved, the edge of familiar humor warming her expression. "Slow? Miracles happen," Jason murmured. Maya glanced up at him, then at Sophie, as if watching the grown-ups share a secret she couldn't quite decode. "May I?" Jason asked, gesturing toward the small basket of muffins near Maya. Sophie gave a small nod, her eyes watchful. Jason reached over carefully, and as he did, Maya surprised him. She pushed the basket a little closer to his hand, her small fingers brushing his briefly. It was a fleeting touch, barely a moment, but Jason felt his heart catch in his throat. "Thank you, sweetheart," Sophie murmured, smoothing Maya's hair. Jason cleared his throat, peeling back the muffin wrapper slowly. "Maya, do you like puzzles?" Maya's head tilted slightly. She didn't answer right away, but her brow furrowed in a thoughtful way that made Jason's chest tighten. "She's a puzzle queen," Sophie said softly. "She can sit with one for hours." Jason smiled. "Maybe you could teach me. I was never very good at them." For the first time, Maya gave a shy half-smile, small but real, before ducking her head behind her rabbit. Sophie exhaled, a quiet release of tension. Jason met her eyes, and in that shared look, something unspoken passed between them, something tentative and fragile. Later that morning, as they walked toward the gardens, Sophie hung back, letting Maya skip ahead to a small fountain where Elena, the hotel concierge, knelt to adjust the flowers. "She's been good here," Sophie murmured, falling into step beside Jason. Away from the noise. Jason glanced at her, surprised by the note of weariness in her voice. "You look tired," he said softly. Sophie gave him a sharp glance. "Raising a child alone will do that to you." Jason winced. "That wasn't—" "I know." Sophie sighed, pressing her hand briefly to her forehead. "I'm sorry. This is a lot, Jason." He nodded, hands in his pockets. "For me too." For a moment they watched Maya, who was laughing softly as Elena showed her how to float petals on the water. "She seems happy," Jason said quietly. Sophie's face softened. "She's resilient, but she's also sensitive. You can't rush her." "I'm not great at patience," Jason admitted. Sophie smiled faintly. "No. You never were." Jason turned toward her. The air between them charged now, old memories flickering at the edges of their words. "Sophie." His voice dropped. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sophie's eyes darkened. "Because I was scared you'd take her, or that you'd feel obligated and resent her for it, or that you'd throw money at the problem and think it was enough." Jason flinched. "I wouldn't have." "You say that now." Sophie's voice was soft but steady. "But back then, you were married to Wolf Innovations, Jason. There was no room for anything else." He swallowed hard, shame flooding his chest. "I'm not that man anymore," he said quietly. "We'll see," Sophie murmured, her gaze lingering on him for a beat too long before she turned away. Jason stood there, watching the two people who mattered more than anything he had built, and realizing, with a quiet ache, that the hardest deal of his life wasn't going to happen in a boardroom. It was happening here, under the California sun, one small step at a time. By the time afternoon sunlight slanted across the terrace, Jason Wolf was restless. He wasn't used to this kind of waiting. In the world he ruled, patience was a luxury he paid others to have. But here, with Sophie and Maya, every interaction felt like walking a tightrope over unfamiliar ground. He had read contracts, negotiated billion-dollar mergers, stood toe-to-toe with hostile CEOs, but nothing had prepared him for a quiet lunch at a hotel cafe where a 3-year-old's silence carried more weight than any boardroom verdict. Now, standing near the garden where Maya played in a patch of wildflowers, Jason felt the pull of old habits. His phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. Derek. Jason pulled it out, glancing at the screen. "Crisis brewing. PR is calling. News leak daughter. Call ASAP." He sucked in a sharp breath, the ground tilting under his feet. He hadn't expected it this fast. Maybe he should have. Nothing stayed private in his world for long. "Jason," Sophie's voice cut through his thoughts. He turned to see her approaching, arms crossed loosely over her chest, her face wary. "You okay?" she asked. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Fine." Her eyes narrowed just slightly. "You've never been a good liar." Jason sighed, raking a hand through his hair. "There's a leak. Someone tipped the press." Sophie's face paled. About her," Jason said quietly, glancing toward Maya, who was now crouched by a bed of tulips, absorbed in her own small world. "About you." For a moment, Sophie closed her eyes, her shoulders stiffening. "I should have known this was a mistake," she murmured. "We should have stayed away." Jason stepped closer. "It's not your fault." Sophie let out a dry laugh. "Isn't it? I brought her here." "I brought us here. We'll manage this." Jason's voice was firm, the CEO in him flickering to life. "I can contain the damage." Sophie's eyes flashed, her posture tightening. That's exactly what I was afraid of. He blinked, caught off guard. What do you mean? You always think you can fix things with money, with spin, with control, Sophie said, her voice low and shaking now. But this isn't a scandal to clean up, Jason. This is a child's life. Her life. Jason opened his mouth, then closed it, the weight of her words sinking in. She doesn't need a fixer, Sophie went on, her voice softening. She needs a father. It was the kind of truth that landed like a stone in his chest, solid and immovable. For a long beat, they stood there, the sounds of laughter and soft conversation drifting from the cafe, the distant crash of waves filling the silence between them. I want to be that for her, Jason said finally, his voice quieter now. I don't know how, Sophie. But I want to try. Sophie searched his face, her eyes stormy with doubt, and something Jason hadn't seen in years. Vulnerability. Then show me, she whispered. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Jason made a half-hearted attempt to take calls in his suite, but every time his phone rang, his gaze drifted to the window, to the garden below where Sophie and Maya lingered in the fading light. By 5 o'clock, Derek had sent 5 increasingly urgent texts and a curt voicemail. You can't disappear, Jason. The board is spooked, but Jason was already loosening his tie, stepping out of his polished shoes and heading downstairs. Outside, he found Maya sitting cross-legged on the grass, her fingers weaving tiny flowers into a chain. Sophie sat nearby on a bench, watching her with a quiet mix of affection and exhaustion. Jason hesitated for only a second before crouching beside Maya. Hi there, he murmured. Maya looked up, her eyes wary but curious. What are you making? Jason asked. She held up the daisy chain, small fingers smudged with green. Jason's throat tightened. It's beautiful, he said softly. Maya blinked at him. Then, in a move that startled them both, she reached out and placed the chain in his hand. Jason froze, staring at the delicate crown of flowers resting in his palm. Behind them, Sophie watched, her arms hugging her knees to her chest, her eyes glistening. She's starting to trust you, Sophie said quietly. Jason looked up, meeting Sophie's gaze. There was something raw there now, something open and trembling at the edges, and for the first time in years, Jason Wolfe understood. This wasn't about winning. It was about showing up. It was about staying. And he knew, with a sudden piercing clarity, that no deal he had ever closed, no company he had ever built, would matter half as much as what he chose to do next. Later, back in his suite, Jason sat on the edge of the bed, turning the tiny daisy chain over in his hands. His phone buzzed again on the nightstand. Derek, we need you back in LA tomorrow. This can't wait. Jason looked at the phone. Then he looked at the flowers. And for the first time in a long, long time, Jason Wolfe turned the phone off. Jason stood barefoot in the suite, the cool marble floor grounding him as dawn's first light spilled over the coastline. He turned the daisy chain over in his fingers, delicate and imperfect, the petals slightly crushed from his grip the night before. He should have been on a plane by now. Derek's messages were piling up. Board meeting at 9. Stock is sliding on takeover rumors. Where are you, Jason? For once, Jason Wolfe, the man who never missed a call, never delayed a deal, was still. Downstairs, the hotel stirred awake. He could already hear the low hum of conversation in the cafe, the clink of cutlery, the soft shuffle of early risers heading to the beach. Somewhere down there, Sophie and Maya were probably finishing breakfast. Jason raked a hand through his hair and exhaled. This was a mistake. This was everything he didn't know how to handle. And yet, when he closed his eyes, all he saw was Maya's small, hesitant hand placing that daisy chain in his palm, and Sophie's quiet, watchful gaze. By the time he reached the terrace, Sophie was sitting alone, a cup of coffee cradled between her hands. She looked up as he approached, her features soft but guarded. "She's with Elena," Sophie said, nodding toward the gardens where Maya was helping the concierge feed the koi fish in the pond. "I thought we could talk." Jason eased into the chair opposite her, his chest tight with things he didn't know how to say. Sophie studied him for a moment, her dark eyes clear and unflinching. "You're supposed to be in LA today." "I know. Your assistant called. Twice." Her lips tugged into the faintest smile. "He sounds like a handful." Jason huffed out a quiet laugh. "Derek's the best I've got. And right now he's furious." Sophie's smile faded. She wrapped her hands tighter around the mug. "Why are you still here, Jason?" He went still. For a moment he wanted to give her the polished, practiced answer. The kind he was known for. The kind that deflected and smoothed over the cracks. But when he met her eyes, he felt it. The old, familiar tug he used to ignore. The one that asked him to be real. "Because I don't want to miss this," Jason said softly. "Because if I get on that plane, I don't know when I'll come back." Sophie's throat bobbed. Her gaze drifted to the gardens, where Maya was tossing crumbs into the water, squealing with delight as the koi darted to the surface. "She's a good kid," Sophie murmured. "She's resilient." "But Jason," her voice cracked just slightly, "don't break her heart." Jason felt something inside him twist, sharp and aching. "I won't," he said, the promise scraping raw against his throat. Sophie looked back at him then, and for the first time since their marriage ended, he saw something flicker across her face. Not anger, not fear, but a tentative flicker of belief. Later that afternoon, Jason found himself alone with Maya for the first time. Sophie had stepped away to take a call, and Jason sat cross-legged on the grass, while Maya carefully lined up seashells in the sand. She was quiet, absorbed in her own world, occasionally glancing up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Those are beautiful," Jason said softly, nodding toward the shells. Maya offered no reply, but after a moment she picked up a small pink one and placed it gently near his knee. Jason felt his chest tighten. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his sleek silver watch. "Would you like to see something special?" Maya's eyes flickered toward him, wary, but intrigued. He held the watch out, letting the sunlight catch the face. "This was my father's," he said quietly. "He gave it to me when I started my company. Said I'd need something to remind me when it was time to come home." Maya reached out tentatively, her tiny fingers grazing the cool metal. Jason smiled faintly. "I forgot to listen to it." For a long beat, they sat like that. Two strangers tethered by blood, by time, by the fragile beginnings of something neither of them quite understood. When Sophie returned, she paused at the edge of the garden, watching them in the golden light. Jason glanced up, meeting her eyes, and in that look was something new, a fragile peace, an unspoken agreement. They would figure this out, together. Besides that evening, as Jason walked Sophie and Maya back to their room, his phone buzzed again. Derek. Media waiting at LAX, rumors swirling. "You're needed now." Jason stared at the message. Then he powered off the phone. Sophie watched him quietly. "Trouble?" Jason slid the phone into his pocket. "Not tonight." Sophie gave him a long, searching look, and for the first time in years, Jason felt like a man who was not just admired or feared, but seen. When they reached the door, Maya tugged gently at Sophie's hand, whispering something in her ear. Sophie crouched, brushing a hand through Maya's hair, then looked up at Jason. "She wants you to read her a story tomorrow," Sophie said, a soft, almost amused note in her voice. Jason's heart stuttered. "I'd like that," he murmured. Sophie gave him the faintest smile, then ushered Maya inside, the door closing with a quiet click. Jason stood in the hallway for a long moment, one hand resting against the wall, eyes closed. He had built an empire. He had conquered markets. But here in this small, sunlit corner of the world, Jason Wolfe was just beginning to learn what it meant to build something that mattered. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip through his hands. Jason arrived at breakfast early. He was rarely early for anything. His life ran on meetings, flights, and meticulously blocked schedules. But this morning, he found himself in the hotel cafe before Sophie and Maya, sipping black coffee and watching the ocean beyond the terrace, the weight of anticipation curling tight in his chest. The waiter set a second coffee across from him, offering a knowing smile. Jason only nodded, heart thumping a little faster when he caught sight of them at the entrance. Sophie held Maya's hand, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail, simple but still effortlessly striking. Maya clutched her stuffed rabbit, eyes bright as they scanned the tables. When her gaze landed on Jason, she smiled, small, hesitant, but real. That smile hit Jason harder than any stock crash or boardroom ambush ever had. "Morning," Sophie said softly as they reached the table. "Good morning," Jason echoed, rising instinctively, though Sophie waved him back down with a smirk. As they settled in, Jason watched Maya chatter about the koi fish and the very old turtle Elena had shown her. He listened, not with the distracted nod he so often gave during business dinners, but with his full attention, marveling at the tiny details she noticed, the earnest way she spoke. This, he thought, was what he'd missed. Not just birthdays or milestones, but the small, ordinary moments that stitched a life together. When breakfast was nearly over, Derek appeared. Jason stiffened. Derek's sharp, tailored figure and quick, assessing glance stood out in the breezy, coastal setting. His assistant offered a polite nod to Sophie, then leaned close to Jason. "Press outside," Derek murmured. "Board's panicking. LAX won't stay quiet much longer. You need to get ahead of this, Jace." Jason exhaled slowly, eyes drifting to Maya, who was focused on arranging her fruit slices into a smiley face. Sophie's hand curled protectively around her coffee cup. "Go ahead," she said softly, a familiar tension flickering in her voice. "Handle it." Jason's gaze snapped to her. "I'm not leaving," he said, the words surprising even himself. Sophie arched an eyebrow. "You're serious." Derek gave a quiet cough. "Jason, with all due respect." Jason lifted a hand, palm out. "I said, I'm not leaving." Sophie searched his face, and for a moment the air between them felt charged, thick with old history and new uncertainty. Derek, to his credit, didn't press. He only gave Jason a long, measuring look. "If you change your mind, I'll be in the lobby." When he left, Jason let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Sophie sat back, crossing her arms lightly over her chest. "This isn't just a vacation, is it?" she murmured. Jason shook his head slowly. "No." A beat of silence stretched between them. "You know," Sophie said quietly, "there's a reason I didn't tell you, Jason. A reason I stayed away." He met her gaze, something raw, flickering in his eyes. "I know." But she shook her head, her voice gentler now. No, I don't think you do. Jason waited, his throat tight. I didn't want to raise Maya in the shadow of all this. Sophie's hand gestured, vaguely, at the luxury, the media, the storm circling just beyond the hotel walls. I didn't want her to be a headline, or a photo op, or a scandal. Jason's shoulders sagged slightly. You think I would have used her like that? I think, Sophie said carefully, that back then you didn't know how to love anything you couldn't control. The words hit like a quiet blow. Jason looked away, swallowing hard, but Sophie leaned in slightly, her eyes softening. I also think people change. Jason's chest tightened. He reached across the table, fingers brushing the edge of Maya's empty juice glass. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, his voice rough. But I want to learn. Sophie held his gaze for a long moment. Finally, she exhaled and gave a small, tired smile. That's a start. Later that afternoon, they sat together on the beach, the three of them, under the shade of a wide umbrella. Maya was building a crooked sandcastle, her laughter floating on the breeze. Jason crouched beside her, carefully pressing wet sand into a small plastic mold, trying and failing to make it stay. Sophie watched from her chair, sunglasses shielding her eyes, a book resting on her lap. And for the first time in years, Jason Wolfe felt something unexpected stir in his chest. Not control. Not ambition. Contentment. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. And as he watched Maya's face light up when her sandcastle finally held, and heard Sophie's soft, amused laugh behind him, Jason realized something he hadn't understood until now. This was the first empire he'd ever wanted to build that had nothing to do with power. It had everything to do with love. So, Jason stared out at the ocean, the sun slipping low, casting a gold wash over the water. Maya's delighted laughter drifted from where she ran along the shore, tiny feet kicking up sand, Sophie trailing behind her with a watchful, patient smile. It should have been perfect. But in Jason's pocket, his phone vibrated again. Its faint hum a constant pulse of the world he'd tried, for 3 days, to hold at bay. He closed his eyes, counted to 5, and ignored it. Sophie reached him first, brushing damp hair from her face, breathless from chasing Maya down the beach. She lowered herself onto the sand beside him, stretching her legs out, toes burrowing into the cool grit. She's got your determination, she murmured, a soft smile curving her lips. And your refusal to quit. Jason huffed out a low laugh, but it faded quickly. Sophie's eyes flicked to him. You okay? He hesitated. The board's panicking. Her face softened slightly. I'm surprised you've lasted this long without a helicopter showing up on the beach. Jason smiled wryly, but said nothing. For a few moments they sat in a quiet that felt surprisingly comfortable, the kind of silence Jason had rarely shared with anyone. Sophie tucked her knees to her chest, arms wrapped loosely around them, her skin kissed golden by the sun, her hair curling at the ends. Jason turned toward her, his chest tightening. Why did you really come here, Sophie? She tilted her head, resting her chin on her knees. I told you. No. His voice was gentle but insistent. Not just for Maya. Sophie's lips pressed into a thin line. She stared out at the water. The horizon stretched wide and endless. I needed to see, she said softly. If you were still... You. Jason's brow furrowed. You? The man I married, Sophie murmured. The man I used to love. The words hung there, raw and tender, stirring something deep in Jason's chest. For a moment, neither spoke. Jason felt the old walls inside him shift, those carefully fortified defenses that had kept him safe but alone for so long. Before he could find words, Maya came bounding up, cheeks flushed, clutching a battered seashell. "Mama, look!" Sophie smiled, opening her hands to admire the treasure, kissing Maya's hair as the little girl settled between them. Jason watched them, something sharp and bittersweet tightening in his throat. For a fleeting second, he imagined it, the three of them, not as strangers navigating an awkward reunion, but as a family. Real, whole. And then his phone vibrated again, and everything fractured. Lisa's back in the suite. Jason paced the balcony, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and tense. "No, Derek, I'm not flying back tonight," he said, fingers tightening on the railing. "Because this matters." "Yes, more than the stock price. Handle it." He ended the call, chest tight with frustration, only to turn and find Sophie standing in the doorway, arms folded across her chest. "So," she said quietly, "we're back here again." Jason dragged a hand through his hair. "It's not what you think." "It's always what I think, Jason." Her voice wasn't angry, just tired, as if she'd carried this disappointment for years. "You can't keep one foot in two worlds forever." He stepped toward her, his expression softening. "I'm trying." Sophie's gaze flickered, something pained in her eyes. "I know you are." For a long beat they stood there, the distance between them at once small and vast. Jason exhaled. "What do you want from me, Sophie?" "I don't want anything," she said quietly. But she does. Her gaze drifted past him, toward the garden where Maya's small figure could be seen through the window, head bent over a coloring book. "She needs you, Jason. Fully. Not half here, half on your phone. Not today. Gone tomorrow." Sophie's voice trembled faintly. "I need to know you can be that for her." Jason swallowed hard, throat tight. "And you?" he asked, voice low. Sophie's eyes flicked up to his, and for a moment, the guardedness fell away, revealing the woman he'd once held in his arms, the woman he'd let slip through his fingers. "I stopped needing you a long time ago," she said softly, but her voice wavered at the edges, betraying her. Jason stepped closer, so close he could see the fine tremble of her breath, the flicker of old longing in her gaze. "Maybe," he murmured, "but I never stopped needing you." For a second, something raw and electric pulsed between them. An old ache, a remembered pull. But Sophie drew back first, arms crossing tighter, a faint shake of her head. "Don't do that, Jason. Don't make promises you can't keep." And with that, she turned, walking away, leaving Jason standing alone in the fading light, the hum of his phone in his pocket, and the memory of a family he was only beginning to understand he could lose all over again. Jason sat alone on the terrace, elbows on his knees, fingers pressed to his temples as if he could squeeze the tension away. Below, the ocean churned in restless waves, and the night breeze carried the soft sounds of laughter and music from the hotel bar. But Jason heard none of it. His phone buzzed. Again. He let it go to voicemail. Derek's text followed within seconds. "They're threatening to call an emergency vote. Get back to LA, Jason." This takeover is real. Jason exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. His empire, everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed for, was teetering. And yet, when he closed his eyes, it wasn't boardroom tables or rival CEOs he saw. It was Sophie, walking away from him at sunset, her voice trembling with disappointment. It was Maya's small, hopeful smile as she placed a daisy chain in his palm. He was losing everything on both fronts. Besuk Sophie sat in the lounge near the hotel lobby, a cup of tea cradled in her hands as Maya colored beside her. Her shoulders were tense, her mind drifting between worry and exhaustion. When Jason strode in, his face tight, she knew, before he even spoke, that something had snapped. "Sophie," he said, his voice rough, "we need to talk." She glanced up warily, motioning for Maya to stay put. Together, they moved toward a quieter corner of the lobby, where the soft glow of the fireplace flickered against the polished marble. "I have to go back," Jason said, cutting to the chase. His eyes were tired, raw around the edges. "Tonight." Sophie closed her eyes, her chest tightening. "Of course." "It's not—" He broke off, shaking his head. "I didn't plan this, but the company, my board, they're panicking." "And you can't risk losing it," Sophie murmured, her voice soft but edged with steel. Jason flinched. "It's not just about the company." "No?" Sophie's eyes searched his face. "Because from where I stand, Jason, it's always about the company." The sharpness in her tone surprised even her. She hadn't come here to fight. But she was tired, so tired of watching him stand at a crossroads and walk away every time. "I'm trying," Jason whispered, his hands clenched at his sides. "You have no idea how hard I'm trying." Sophie let out a shaky breath. "I do know. I watched you try, at us, at marriage, at balance, and every time the company won." Jason looked away, his jaw tightening. "This isn't fair." "No," Sophie agreed softly. "It's not. For any of us." For a moment, Jason stood motionless, his fingers flexing as if he wanted to reach for her. But the space between them had never felt wider. Maya wandered over then, her small voice cutting through the tension. "Mama?" Sophie crouched quickly, pulling her daughter close. "Hey baby, what's up?" Maya peeked up at Jason shyly, thumb in her mouth, her free hand gripping her stuffed rabbit. Jason knelt, trying to smile through the knot in his throat. "Hi, sweetheart." Maya shifted closer to Sophie, eyes wide and uncertain. Jason's heart clenched. He realized then the trust he'd started to build, the fragile bridge they'd been crossing together, was paper thin, and with one wrong step, it would tear. Sophie rose slowly, cradling Maya against her hip. Her voice was quiet, tired, resigned. "Go, Jason. Do what you need to do." Jason opened his mouth, desperate for words that could hold her, hold them, here in this moment. But none came. He watched as Sophie turned, as Maya's little arm wrapped tightly around her mother's neck, as they walked away together, their figures retreating into the glow of the lobby lights. Jason's phone buzzed again in his pocket. This time, he didn't silence it. He pulled it out, stared at the screen, and for the first time in years, Jason Wolf didn't feel powerful. He felt empty. Up in his suite, Jason stood at the window, his packed overnight bag on the bed, his private jet waiting on the tarmac. But he couldn't move. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, watching the ocean swell and crash below, feeling the pull of two worlds tearing him apart. There was a knock at the door. Jason turned sharply, frowning. When he opened it, Derek stood there, still sharp in his tailored blazer, though his usual polished calm was roughened by frustration. "I called the car," Derek said quietly. "We're cutting it close." Jason rubbed at the back of his neck. "Derek." But Derek shook his head, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Listen, Jace, you want me to fix this?" to run interference, to save your company from falling apart while you figure out what the hell you want. His voice was low, but fierce. But here's the thing. Only you can decide what you're willing to lose. Jason stiffened. Derek's voice softened. You've got a shot here. With her, with that little girl, at something real. And yeah, maybe you blow it. Maybe you fail. But if you walk away now, Derek's eyes met his. You fail for sure. Jason swallowed hard. I'll stall the board, Derek said after a beat. But you need to make a choice. And then, without another word, Derek walked out, the door clicking softly behind him. Jason stood there for a long, breathless moment, the weight of his empire pressing down on one shoulder, and the fragile hope of something more pressing against the other. And for the first time in his life, Jason Wolf realized that no matter what he chose, the life he'd always known was already cracking apart. Jason sat in the dim light of the suite, shoulders hunched, tie loosened, a glass of untouched whiskey resting by his elbow. The packed overnight bag sat accusingly on the bed, waiting like a silent witness. He could still hear Sophie's voice echoing in his head, soft, resigned, laced with the quiet ache he hadn't been able to fix. Go, Jason. Do what you need to do. And he hated how easily she'd said it. Hated that she was bracing herself to be left behind. Hated, most of all, that part of her still believed he would always choose the Empire over her, over their daughter. The room was quiet, except for the soft crash of waves against the rocks below. He was supposed to be on a jet right now. He was supposed to be on his way to salvage the board, the company, the kingdom he had built with his own two hands. Instead, Jason Wolf sat alone, staring at the woman and child who had slipped through his fingers once, and who, if he wasn't careful, would slip away again. Downstairs, Sophie sat curled on a lounge chair near the garden, a light cardigan pulled around her shoulders. Maya had fallen asleep curled in her lap, thumb tucked into her mouth. Dark lashes fanned across her cheeks. Sophie watched the moonlight dance across the waves, her chest heavy, her mind restless. She hadn't meant to fight with Jason tonight. But God, it was so hard not to brace for disappointment when you'd learned to survive without someone for so long. She felt the familiar swirl of anger and sadness, the sharp edges of love that hadn't died, only hardened. Beautiful night. Sophie turned, surprised to find Elena, the hotel concierge, lowering herself into the chair beside her, a gentle smile softening her elegant features. She's an angel, Elena murmured, nodding toward Maya. Sophie smiled faintly, brushing a hand through her daughter's curls. She's my whole world. Elena's eyes twinkled. And he's trying, you know. Sophie let out a shaky breath. I know. Elena leaned back, hands folded loosely in her lap. You're both scared. That's the hard part. Sophie glanced at her, heart squeezing. He doesn't know how to stay. Elena's smile was kind. Maybe he's trying to learn. Back in his suite, Jason's phone buzzed again. He reached for it, thumb hovering over the screen, and then he let it fall to the table. Instead, he stood, pushing a hand through his hair, and walked to the window. Below, he spotted them, Sophie and Maya, moonlit figures near the garden. Sophie's head tilted back against the chair, Maya a small, sleeping bundle in her arms. The sight undid something in him, something deep, something raw. He'd been so sure once that success would fill every hollow space in his life. But standing here, Jason realized, all the deals, all the wealth, all the power, none of it mattered if he failed at this. At them. To tease an hour later, Jason found himself in the garden, drawn by something he couldn't name. Sophie looked up as he approached, her expression surprised, wary, hopeful all at once. "I thought you'd be gone by now," she murmured. Jason lowered himself onto the chair beside her, elbows on his knees, gaze fixed on the sleeping curve of Maya's small body. "I was supposed to be," he said quietly. Sophie's lips parted, but no sound came. Jason scrubbed a hand over his face. "I called Derek, told him to handle it." Her breath caught faintly. "And the board?" "They'll survive," Jason murmured. "Maybe for the first time, they'll learn they're not the center of my universe." He looked at her then, and Sophie saw it. The cracks in the armor, the raw, uncertain man beneath. "I don't know how to do this," Jason confessed, voice rough. "I've spent so long chasing everything else. I don't know how to be here." Sophie's eyes softened, the sharp edges of her heart loosening just a little. "You start," she whispered, "by showing up." Jason let out a shaky laugh, half bitter, half awed. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," Sophie admitted, "but it's worth it." For a moment they sat in silence, the night folding around them, the only sound Maya's soft, even breathing. Then Jason glanced at Sophie, his voice low, hesitant. "Do you think she'll forgive me?" Sophie met his gaze, and for the first time in years Jason saw no anger there, only a fierce aching tenderness. "She already has," Sophie murmured, brushing a kiss to Maya's head. "You just have to earn it." Jason swallowed hard, a lump thick in his throat. He reached out, tentative, unsure, and gently rested his hand over Maya's small foot, feeling the faint warmth through the blanket. And in that moment, something inside Jason Wolfe shifted. Not a grand gesture. Not a dramatic vow, just a quiet, trembling step toward the family he was finally ready to fight for. The morning came with an unfamiliar quiet. Jason stood on the balcony, coffee cooling in his hand, as the sun spilled gold across the water. Below, he could just make out Sophie and Maya walking along the beach, tiny silhouettes in the widening light. Sophie's hair lifted in the breeze, and Maya darted in and out of the waves, squealing with each splash. For the first time in years, Jason felt something like peace. But it was a fragile thing, delicate as glass. A knock at the door shattered it. Jason frowned, setting his cup down. When he opened the door, he was surprised to see Elena, the hotel concierge, standing there with an envelope in her hand. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Mr. Wolfe," Elena said softly, "but this was left at the front desk for you. The sender said it was urgent." Jason took the envelope, his brow furrowing. "Thank you." Elena hesitated. "She's a good woman, you know." Jason's mouth tightened faintly. "I know." With a knowing smile, Elena turned and left. Jason closed the door, breaking the seal on the envelope. Inside was a thin stack of papers, and the moment his eyes caught the name at the top, his heart slammed into his ribs. Medical records. Sophie Carter. His vision blurred as he scanned the words. Stage Y breast cancer. Surgery, treatment completed. Clean scans, 6 months ago. Jason sank onto the edge of the bed, the weight of the pages pulling his chest tight. She hadn't told him. All this time, through the anger, the distance, the heartbreak, she had carried this alone. And suddenly, everything clicked into place. The quiet exhaustion in her eyes, the fierce protectiveness around Maya, the walls she'd built around herself. Jason felt his stomach twist, his throat close. He thought he'd known the stakes. He'd been wrong. By the time Jason reached the beach, Sophie was sitting on a towel, hair damp from the ocean. Maya curled beside her, cheeks pink from the sun. Sophie looked up as he approached, and the easy smile she gave him faltered the moment she saw his face. "What is it?" she asked softly, rising to her feet. Jason opened his mouth, but for a long moment no sound came. Then finally, his voice broke low and raw. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sophie's eyes widened, her arms crossing instinctively over her chest. "Tell you what?" He swallowed hard, lifting the crumpled papers in his hand. "About the cancer." Sophie froze, color draining from her face. Jason saw it then, the flicker of panic, the instinct to retreat, the old wounds flaring raw and open. But he stepped forward before she could pull away. "Sophie," he murmured, "why did you carry that alone?" Sophie let out a shaky breath, arms wrapping tighter around herself. "Because you weren't there." The word struck like a blade. "I didn't want to need you," she whispered, eyes shimmering. "You were gone, Jason." And I was so angry, so hurt. And then when Maya came, I just focused on her. I put everything I had into keeping her safe, keeping myself strong. There wasn't room for anything else. Jason's throat worked, his voice rough. "I would have been there." Sophie gave a soft, bitter laugh. "Would you have? Or would you have sent flowers and a check from halfway across the world?" She shook her head, blinking hard. I didn't want to test the answer. Jason felt himself flinch, his chest cracking wide. He looked past her at Maya dancing barefoot in the shallows, her small face lifted to the sun. And in that moment, Jason felt the sharp edge of regret more deeply than he ever had in his life. "I was a fool," he whispered. "I didn't just walk away from you, Sophie. I walked away from a life. From this." Sophie's expression softened, a tremor in her lips. "It's not too late," she murmured, voice almost breaking. Jason reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers, hesitant but aching for an anchor. "I'm here," he whispered. "Tell me how to stay." For a long, breathless moment, Sophie just stood there, her heart in her throat, the familiar war between hope and fear flickering in her eyes. Then, slowly, she laced her fingers through his. And for the first time in years, Jason Wolfe felt the walls between them give way. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jason sat with Sophie and Maya on the beach. Maya curled into his lap, thumb tucked into her mouth, her breath warm against his chest. Sophie leaned lightly against his shoulder, their fingers intertwined in the sand. The world beyond this place, the empire, the chaos, the noise, faded into something small and distant. And Jason, for the first time, understood what it meant to belong. Not to a company, not to a fortune, but to a family. Summer Jason had never known silence could be this loud. The suite was quiet, the only sound the rhythmic breathing of Maya, asleep in the adjoining room. Sophie stood by the balcony doors, her arms wrapped around herself, her silhouette framed by moonlight as the ocean roared softly beyond the glass. Jason watched her, his heart aching. He had spent years mastering boardrooms, controlling crises, negotiating mergers. But none of that prepared him for the raw, unsteady ground between them now. He moved quietly toward her, his voice low. "Sophie." She didn't turn. "I'm tired, Jason." Her words floated gently in the space between them, not sharp, not angry, just weary. He stopped behind her, close enough to reach out, but not daring to. "I know." For a long moment, the only thing between them was the hush of the waves and the hum of unspoken things. Sophie let out a soft, broken laugh. It's strange, isn't it? You can carry something as heavy as fear for years, and then one conversation, and you're left standing in the rubble. Jason's chest tightened. I should have been there. Sophie finally turned, her face shadowed, her eyes shimmering. It wasn't just the cancer, Jason. It was everything. It was coming home to an empty apartment, going to appointments alone, feeling like I was screaming into a void. It was the slow, painful realization that the man I married loved his company more than his family. Her voice cracked, and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Jason's jaw clenched, his throat working around words he'd never learned to say. I'm scared too, he whispered, of messing this up, of not knowing how to be what you both need, of waking up one day and realizing I failed at the one thing that actually matters. Sophie's eyes softened, but she shook her head, a sad smile ghosting across her lips. You're used to winning, Jason. But this isn't something you win. He let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. Then how do I keep you from walking away again? Sophie stepped closer, close enough for him to see the freckles dusted across her cheeks, the faint lines carved by sleepless nights and quiet endurance. You don't, she murmured. You show up, you stay, you try. And some days you fail, and you try again. Jason reached for her hand, fingers hesitant, heart hammering. For a beat, Sophie stood still. Then slowly, she laced her fingers through his. I don't want Maya to grow up thinking love is conditional, she whispered. Or that she has to be perfect to be loved. Jason's voice cracked. Neither do I. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Sophie exhaled, resting her forehead lightly against his shoulder, her body taut with old grief and tentative hope. Jason wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair, holding on, not tightly, not to control, but softly, just to be there. The next morning came too quickly. Jason sat on the edge of the bed, watching the early light spill across the floor, watching Maya as she stirred in her sleep. Sophie moved quietly around the suite, pulling on a cardigan, her hair still damp from the shower. There was no talk of the boardroom, no mention of his phone, which remained dark on the nightstand. Instead, there was only the soft shuffle of Sophie, slipping into the chair beside him, the quiet weight of Maya curling into his lap when she woke, the sleepy warmth of her small arms around his neck. Jason felt something settle deep inside, a trembling peace he hadn't known he needed. Do you think, Sophie murmured later as they watched Maya play on the balcony, you can really step back from the company? Jason swallowed hard, his voice quiet. I don't know, but I know I want to try. Sophie searched his face, her eyes wary but soft. And if you can't? Jason met her gaze, raw and unguarded. Then at least you'll know I fought for the right thing. For a moment, Sophie said nothing. Then she reached across the space between them and gently rested her hand over his. Outside, Maya's laughter floated up into the morning light, and for the first time, Jason Wolfe felt the beginnings of something real, something lasting, something that didn't come with a contract or a dollar sign. It was fragile. It was unfinished, but it was his, and this time he wasn't walking away. But as Jason stood on the hotel balcony, the early evening light soft against the ocean, his phone heavy in his hand. The screen flashed with Derek's name again, his assistant's texts piling up with phrases like urgent, vote tonight, and you're about to lose control. He turned the phone face down on the table. Behind him, Sophie's quiet voice drifted through the open door. She was helping Maya with her shoes, her words patient and gentle, as the little girl giggled and squirmed. It was the kind of moment Jason knew he had walked past 1,000 times in his old life without seeing it. Now, he couldn't stop seeing it. He heard the soft shuffle of Sophie's footsteps as she approached, felt her presence before she spoke. "You should go," she said quietly, arms crossed over her chest as she leaned against the doorframe. "It's your company, Jason." He turned to look at her, heart hammering. "It's just a company," he murmured. Sophie gave a soft, sad smile. "That's not how you used to feel." Jason let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair. Maybe that's the problem. She studied him for a beat, her eyes searching, wary and hopeful all at once. "I don't want you to stay and resent me," she said gently. "I don't want to be the reason you lose everything you've built." Jason crossed the space between them, cupping her face in his hands, his touch tentative. "You're not the reason," he whispered. "You're the reason I'm finally seeing what matters." For a moment, Sophie closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, and when she opened them, there was something raw and open there, a trembling edge of trust. "I'm scared," she murmured. "We've been down this road, Jason." "I know." His voice cracked. "And this time, I'm not asking you to trust my words. I'm asking you to watch my choices." He stepped back, reached for his phone, and without hesitation, powered it off. For a man whose life had been tethered to that device, the moment felt seismic. Sophie let out a shaky laugh, half surprised, half disbelieving. "You actually turned it off." Jason smiled faintly, slipping the phone into the drawer. "The board will survive. Derek will survive." He looked toward the garden, where Maya was now running toward them, arms outstretched, a wide grin on her face. Jason crouched, catching her in his arms, feeling the small, solid weight of her as she wrapped around him. "I'll survive," Jason murmured against Maya's hair, his voice rough with emotion. "But only if I don't lose this." That night, they sat on the beach under a blanket of stars. Maya had fallen asleep, curled against Jason's side, her head heavy on his chest, her breathing soft and even. Sophie sat beside them, her hand laced through Jason's, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. The waves rolled in and out, the cool sand beneath them grounding, anchoring. Jason let the silence stretch, the peace of the moment sinking deep into his bones. "I keep thinking about my father," Jason said quietly, his voice carrying into the night. "How he was always gone. How I told myself I'd be different. And then I became him." Sophie's fingers tightened around his. "You're not your father, Jason." Jason exhaled, his chin brushing the top of Maya's hair. "I want to be someone Maya looks for in a crowd, not someone she flinches from." Sophie turned, her eyes soft in the moonlight. "You already are." Jason pressed a kiss to Maya's curls, his heart aching and full all at once. For years he had been chasing everything, and now, sitting on a beach with sand in his shoes and a sleeping child in his arms, he realized he had already found the only thing that mattered. He looked at Sophie, his voice low and sure. "I'm done running." Her lips trembled into a smile, her eyes glistening. And for the first time in a long time, Jason Wolf didn't feel like a man holding the world in his hands. He felt like a man finally learning how to hold his heart. The morning air was soft, the kind of crisp that hinted at autumn even in Malibu. Jason stood barefoot on the patio, watching as Sophie and Maya picked wildflowers near the edge of the hotel garden. Maya's laughter floated up toward him, a sound Jason was slowly coming to crave, the lightness, the purity of it. He sipped his coffee slowly, not because he was distracted, but because for the first time in years, he wasn't in a rush. Inside, his phone, powered back on out of courtesy, sat face down on the nightstand. It buzzed occasionally, Derek's name flashing across the screen, but Jason didn't flinch. The board could wait. For once, Jason Wolfe had decided to let his life dictate his schedule, not the other way around. When Sophie glanced up and caught him watching, she gave him a small, private smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. It was the kind of look she used to give him years ago, when they were just two ambitious people stumbling through love, before ambition turned into an avalanche. And in that simple, fleeting moment, Jason felt the quiet shift in her, the slow thawing, the cautious softening. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. It was hope. Later, they walked along the beach, Maya skipping ahead, stopping every few feet to examine a seashell or a tangle of seaweed. Sophie tucked her hands into her sweater, walking beside Jason in a companionable, slightly awkward silence. "She's starting to look for you," Sophie murmured after a while, nodding toward Maya. "Not just tolerate you, expect you." Jason's throat tightened. "I want her to." Sophie smiled softly. "You're doing okay." Jason let out a shaky laugh. "That's the best review I've had all year." They walked a few more steps before Sophie's voice dropped to a more serious note. "What happens when we leave here?" Jason inhaled sharply, the inevitable tension creeping back into his shoulders. "I was hoping we could figure that out together." Sophie tilted her head, watching him. "You're still the CEO of a billion-dollar company, Jason." "I'm also a father," Jason said quietly, surprising even himself with the certainty in his voice. "And I intend to act like it." Sophie's gaze softened, but her eyes remained sharp, measuring. "You're saying all the right things." Jason reached for her hand, brushing his fingers against hers, a tentative, unspoken request. "I'm not looking to be perfect," he murmured, "just better." Sophie hesitated only a moment before her fingers curled loosely into his. For Jason, it was enough. That evening, Derek finally showed up at the hotel, sharp suit, impatient energy, and all. Jason met him in the lounge, waving off the anxious apologies and the update on the company's chaos. Derek's eyes darted toward the beach, where Sophie and Maya were playing in the surf, their laughter carrying into the night. "You're really doing this," Derek said quietly, more statement than question. Jason smiled faintly. "Yeah, I am." Derek let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "You're either the bravest man I know, or the craziest. Maybe both." Jason's gaze softened as he watched Maya tumble into Sophie's arms. "But I finally understand what I stand to lose." Derek clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Go handle your life, Wolf. I'll handle your empire." Jason's grin was crooked, grateful. "Thank you." As Derek turned to leave, Jason caught one last glimpse of his old life walking out the door. Polished, demanding, relentless. He didn't miss it. That night, as they sat together on the balcony, Sophie leaned her head lightly against Jason's shoulder, their hands entwined, Maya curled up in Jason's lap, already halfway to sleep. The stars stretched wide overhead, the ocean whispering its old, endless song. "I never thought we'd find our way back to this," Sophie murmured. Jason kissed the top of Maya's head, his voice low. "Neither did I." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes warm, a quiet smile playing at her lips. "You've changed." Jason shook his head softly. "I'm just finally learning what matters." Sophie's fingers tightened briefly around his. And for the first time in years, Jason Wolf understood that love wasn't a finish line. It wasn't something you won. It was something you chose, over and over, in the quiet, ordinary moments when no one was watching. And this time, he was ready to choose it. The sun rose soft and golden over the Malibu coastline, casting its first light across the sand where Jason stood, barefoot, watching Maya chase the tide in little zigzag patterns. Sophie was beside him, arms folded lightly across her chest, the wind tugging at her hair. Jason glanced at her, catching the faintest smile tugging at her lips as she watched their daughter splash in the shallows. It had been a week since he'd powered down his phone, since he'd told Derek to hold the board together without him, since he'd chosen, truly chosen, to be here. The world hadn't collapsed. The company was still standing, but Jason was no longer the same man. He reached down, scooping up a tiny shell at his feet, the smooth curve of it cool in his hand. Maya came running up, laughing breathlessly, her arms flung wide. "Daddy, look! I found one like yours," she squealed, holding out a lopsided, chipped shell. Jason crouched, heart tight, as he accepted her gift. "It's perfect," he whispered, brushing a kiss to her forehead. Sophie's gaze softened, her eyes shimmering as she watched the two of them. It was a sight she never thought she'd live to see. That afternoon they sat on the hotel patio, sharing lemonade and watching Maya stack cups into shaky towers. "I told Derek I'm stepping back," Jason said quietly, his voice steady. Sophie blinked, setting her glass down. "You're... what?" Jason turned toward her, a faint, self-deprecating smile pulling at his mouth. "Stepping back. Not walking away entirely. I can't. But I'm restructuring, bringing in new leadership, giving them real authority." Sophie stared at him, her brows lifted in cautious surprise. Jason Wolf surrendering control. "That's a headline I never expected." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Neither did I." His smile faded, eyes darkening with something deeper. "But I realized, all this time I thought the company made me who I was. That it gave me worth." His voice cracked just slightly. "But you, and Maya, you're the first thing that's ever made me want to be a better man." Sophie's eyes shimmered, her throat working around unspoken words. Jason reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "I can't undo the past. I can't change how I hurt you or what I missed. But I can choose differently, every day, from now on." For a long, quiet moment, Sophie searched his face, seeing not the polished billionaire, not the powerful CEO, but the man underneath, imperfect, uncertain, and finally willing to risk his heart. A small, tremulous smile curved her lips as she turned her hand under his and laced their fingers together. That evening, they walked the beach as the sun melted into the horizon, painting the sky in pink and amber. Jason carried Maya on his shoulders, her small hands tangled in his hair, her laughter ringing out over the waves. Sophie walked beside him, their arms brushing, a quiet warmth between them. As they reached the edge of the dunes, Jason gently lifted Maya down, setting her on the sand. The little girl darted ahead, chasing the seagulls with squeals of delight. Jason turned to Sophie, his expression raw, open. "I don't know what this is between us," he murmured, "or where it leads. But I want to find out. If you'll let me." Sophie reached up, brushing the wind-blown hair from his forehead, her fingers lingering just a little too long. "You're not the only one who's scared, Jason," she whispered. His chest tightened. I know. She smiled faintly, eyes glistening. But maybe we can be brave together. Jason drew in a shaky breath, his hand slipping to the small of her back, pulling her just slightly closer. And in that quiet, wind-swept moment, the years between them, the wounds, the regrets, the missed chances, softened into something tender, something new. As Maya's laughter drifted back to them on the wind, Jason bent his forehead to Sophie's, his voice a low promise. "I'm here," he whispered. "For good." And under the fading light, with the salt air on their skin and the sound of their daughter's joy in their ears, Jason and Sophie stood on the edge of a new beginning. Not a perfect one, not without fear or uncertainty. But this time, together, and this time with their hearts wide open.